What if your bank account suddenly had no limits? Not because you're wealthy, but because of a flaw no one else discovered. This is the true story of how one man stumbled upon a banking loophole that turned him into a millionaire overnight, and the price he paid for it. Melbourne, Australia, 2011. Dan Sanders was living a life most would call ordinary. He'd left behind his casino job to follow love to a regional town called Wangata, population barely 30,000. When that relationship fell apart, Dan found himself working late nights at a local bar, serving drinks and wondering if this was all life had to offer. But everything changed one rain-soaked night in ways he never could have imagined. It was well past midnight when Dan finished his shift. Like many nights, he'd been drinking with his buddy Mark, who'd already called it quits and headed home. Dan wasn't ready to stop. There was just one problem: his wallet was empty. Stumbling through the rain, he found himself at a National Australia Bank ATM. He had two cards, a debit card linked to his empty savings account, and a credit card that was nearly maxed out at $2,000. His credit balance showed negative $1,995. Only $5 of credit remained. In his intoxicated state, Dan tried something illogical, transferring $200 from his nearly maxed credit card to his empty savings account. Error. Transaction denied. The machine rejected the transfer and spat out his credit card. Any reasonable person would have walked away. But Dan wasn't thinking reasonably. He inserted his savings card, expecting to see zero. Instead, the screen displayed account balance currently unavailable. Curious and confused, he pressed withdrawal and requested $200. The machine whirred to life. Bills emerged from the slot. $200. Real money, from an account that should have been empty. Dan stood there in the rain, holding cash that shouldn't exist, and a dangerous thought formed in his mind. What if I could do this again? Sheltering from the downpour under the ATM's cover, Dan decided to test his theory. He repeated the process. Credit card transfer attempt, error message, savings card check, successful withdrawal. $200 became $400, then $800. By 1 a.m., he'd withdrawn $2,000 from thin air. The next morning, nursing a hangover and questioning his sanity, Dan checked his accounts. His savings showed zero. His credit card still showed negative $1,995. It was as if nothing had happened, except for the $2,000 sitting in his wallet. He waited for consequences. A phone call. Police at his door. Nothing came. 24 hours later, his savings account suddenly showed negative $2,000. The system had caught up, but slowly. The withdrawals appeared, but not the transfers. It was as if the bank's computers knew money had left, but couldn't trace where it came from. Dan realized something crucial. There was a blind spot in the system. Between midnight and 1 a.m., when the ATMs entered a maintenance window disconnected from the central banking servers, impossible transactions became possible. And the correction lag was over 24 hours. This meant if he could repeat the process every single night, he could stay ahead of the system indefinitely. What started as a $2,000 curiosity became a $1 million operation within 4 months. The mechanics were simple but required absolute discipline. Each night, Dan had to be at an ATM between midnight and 1 a.m. to perform his transfers. Miss one night, and the entire house of cards would collapse. His account would suddenly show hundreds of thousands in debt, triggering automatic fraud alerts. He set alarms. Loud, obnoxious alarms that would wake him no matter how drunk or tired he was. The ATM became his prison, a nightly obligation he couldn't escape. But the money? The money was intoxicating. Dan discovered he could withdraw six-figure sums, up to $999,999 in a single transfer. When ATM withdrawal limits became restrictive, he walked straight into the bank, heart pounding, and requested $100,000 in cash. The teller processed it without question. His account balance at that point read over $500,000. To the bank systems, he looked like a wealthy customer. To reality, he was living on borrowed time. Dan called up his old friend Mark and 2 others. "Take time off work," he told them. "I'm about to show you how the other half lives." What followed was 4 months of excess that would make even the wealthy blush. Private jets to Indonesian islands. Entire hotel floors rented for parties. Limousines and helicopters as casual transportation. Dan once paid $90,000 to rent a private plane for a weekend trip. But it wasn't just self-indulgence. Dan gave thousands to street musicians. He handed $40,000 in cash to an elderly couple so they could finally visit Hawaii. He housed homeless people in five-star hotels just to see their reactions. In his mind, he'd become a modern Robin Hood, stealing from a corrupt banking institution and redistributing wealth to those who needed it. The rationalization helped quiet the guilt, at least temporarily. His friends questioned the source of his wealth. "I'm killing it in horse racing," he'd say with a grin. They believed him, until the betting sites flagged his account for suspiciously large wagers, and his employer fired him on the spot. His fiancée left him via text message, assuming he was dealing drugs. His reputation in the small town was destroyed. But by then, Dan had access to more money than he'd ever imagined, and he'd crossed a point of no return. Despite the champagne lifestyle, Dan was crumbling inside. The nightly ATM visits weren't just routine, they were chains. He couldn't travel freely, couldn't relax, couldn't sleep without anxiety. Every phone ring sent his heart racing. Every police car that passed made him certain this was the end. The psychological toll was devastating. He drank more to cope with the fear. His friends were having the time of their lives, but Dan was living a nightmare disguised as a dream. After 4 months and $1.6 million withdrawn, Dan gathered his friends and announced, "I'm done." He made one final round of withdrawals, gave his friends whatever they wanted, and then, for the first time in 120 days, he didn't go to the ATM at midnight. The next morning, his account showed negative $1.6 million. He waited in his hotel room with $80,000 hidden in the bathroom, certain the police would kick down his door at any moment. Days passed, then weeks. Finally, the bank called. "We've noticed unusual activity. Can you explain?" Dan played dumb. They said they'd investigate and threaten police involvement. Then silence. Another month passed. Dan called them. A manager named Bernie answered, blunt and dismissive. "You're a bad boy. You're not getting any more money. The police are investigating. You've ruined your life." But still, nothing happened. Months became a year. A year became 2. The bank kept calling with threats, but no arrests came. No charges were filed. Dan consulted lawyers, but even they were baffled. This case was unprecedented. Dan realized the truth. The bank didn't want this story public. Admitting that a system flaw allowed someone to steal $1.6 million would destroy customer confidence and tank their stock price. The loss they'd take from the exposure would dwarf what Dan had stolen. They were trapped in a stalemate, unable to prosecute without revealing their vulnerability, but unable to let it go either. By 2014, Dan was exhausted from living in limbo. He made a bold decision. He'd force the issue by going public. He contacted newspapers, then a popular television program called A Current Affair. They loved his story, filming reenactments, renting planes and hotels for dramatic effect. Dan thought this would finally bring closure. The episode aired. At the end, the host made a shocking announcement. There's an arrest warrant for Dan Sanders. He's a fugitive. If you know his whereabouts, contact police immediately. Dan was stunned. It was completely fabricated. There was no warrant. But the producers didn't care. They wanted a dramatic ending. Days later, they invited Dan to collect his photos from the station. When he arrived, cameras swarmed him. A police officer, not an investigator, just a friend of the producer, arrested him on the spot. The whole thing was staged for television. At the station, Dan learned the incredible truth. The bank had never filed a police report. There was no investigation. The arrest only happened because Dan confessed on TV, forcing prosecutors to act. Even then, the bank refused to cooperate with the case. They wouldn't release records or account details. Without their participation, the court struggled to understand how the theft even occurred. Dan was sentenced to just 1 year in prison, shockingly light for allegedly stealing $1.6 million. After serving his time, he was released. The actual amount stolen remains unknown since the bank never disclosed figures. It could have been much more than $1.6 million. Dan's story raises an uncomfortable question that each of us must answer honestly. If you discovered this loophole, what would you do? Would you report it? Would you take just enough to solve your immediate problems? Or would you, like Dan, ride it until the wheels fell off? The answer reveals more about us than we might want to admit. This is where our story ends. But the questions it raises about morality, systems, and human nature Those linger long after the credits roll.